Welcome to an exploration of the power of a graceful leader tenets with Truett Tate. Truett and I are here to explore each tenet in a conversational, reflective, and relatable way. Truett is a global leader, an influencer, and a coach. I am the author of A Power of a Graceful Leader, Alexis Thompson. We would love for you to join us in this fun and easily digestible journey into infusing our lives and work with grace. Okay, here we are back with Truett Tate, and I'm really excited. We're going to start digging into the transparency tenet. And this is one that Truett, I'm curious to be in this conversation with you because it's often the first one that emerging leaders are struggling with. Like transparency, I call it appropriateness, because what your transparency is with your mom and what your transparency is with your wife or husband or partner, and then what it is with the people that report to you. That's a big stretch, right? There's a swing in there about appropriateness, because what we would say in one area or experience or show up as, maybe even some of our behaviors, aren't necessarily appropriate in another place that we're at. Yeah, it's one of those things when we get into transparency, I often hear the saying of, I was just being honest. Or, but they're hurting you while they're being honest, or, that's just how I am. I can't help it. That's just who I am. And so when you're emerging in leadership, part of the nuance of it, I have found, and why it's a staple of the tenets here in graceful leadership is understanding your audience, being able to energetically get in tune with where everybody is, and not just live in this head, which knows all things, but to really drop into body and heart. So you're using all three of those resources to discern, this is a place to talk about this safely, or this isn't a place to talk about that safely, or it doesn't add value, or whatever. And leaders that are emerging struggle with that, going from individual contributor, which usually they're an all-star, into a role where they're now responsible for a stead of people and probably didn't receive any training or even maybe read a book to figure out how that might look for them. So can you share with me and the audience, what's the impact of such a person? Do you know someone that you look at other than yourself that walks their talk? Someone that when you saw them lead, you were like, that looks and feels like something that I would like to emulate in my own version of being Truett. And if you could find a person like that, how they impacted how you evolved as a leader.
Okay. I wasn't sure with that preface. I wasn't sure where you were going to go with it.
Thanks for hanging with me.
Yeah, no, that's good. And my guess is that this is the tip of the iceberg anyway. We've got a little bit of time here. I'd probably, three people come to my mind. And if I were to dig deep into all three, we're done with our time. But all of them have really been impactful for me. And I'd say, and so maybe I'll touch lightly on all three, but be my mother is funny when you said that in your little introduction, what we say to our mom versus our spouse versus our boss. But, we talked, I think, in another interview about the extraordinary woman she was. But the fact is she really did walk the talk. She, I think I mentioned to you, when she went to Arizona, she wasn't able to put her label as being a doctor on her wall, on her desk. And you know what? I never saw bitterness. She was the sweet, charming woman that I always knew. And I think she had this kind of inner confidence that being who she was and sticking to it, things would take care of themselves. And now that kind of confidence and honesty, because when you talk about transparency for me, it's honesty. And as it relates to leadership, honesty leads to trust. And trust is what leadership is really all about with large groups of people. I do think that, leadership, when it's two people in the woods and one is more prepared and more experienced, followership is kind of black and white. When you're talking about leading tens of thousands of people, they're only going to get to deal with you once or twice. So they build a sense of trust, and then they make leaps all the time. That's what trust is all about. And you earn trust through being honest and consistent. And you talk a lot in a really good way in your book and in your books and in your talks. There's this connection between, when you say walk the talk, even there are two elements there: behavior and how you communicate who you are, what you believe, what the vision is. And that communication needs to be clear, and it needs to be concise, and it needs to be consistent. And then you walk in accordance to it.
Yeah.
And that combination leads to trust that the next thing you say that there is no experience with, they're willing to say, okay, but I've developed enough trust, I will make that leap. That's the nth degree of real leadership. So, the way my mother communicated and then behaved in alignment with it, was powerful. I think my wife does it. I'm blessed that I have women in my life that are fantastic examples of that. She's a woman of great faith. She, I think, while she was a banker and got her MBA, and I could list all these kind of traditional things. At the end of the day, she wanted to be a leader in the church. She wants to raise children in a great way and be the leader of a great family. Now she's leading a couple of significant charities, and she doesn't get paid. And when people look at some of what she does, I mean, there's a lot of turmoil in some of these. True leadership, many people, lots of money being responsible, and she doesn't flinch at the fact that she does it because it's from the heart. And then maybe the more public one, and again, I'd say this because it's not the first time I've ever pointed it out. I've said it with you. I think Prince Charles, not a perfect man. But if you look at somebody who, versus how regal families, royal families are supposed to live and behave, here's someone who had strong, unorthodox views way ahead of his time on environment and biofarming and architecture and philosophy, while waiting for the opportunity to lead as king, associated with 400 plus charities. And these charities were all concerned with the underprivileged and the underserved, youth, minorities, poor, hungry. And he was quirky. You talk sometimes about labels and such. I really think he didn't care. He had a lot of labels that I think he understood that some were justified, some might not have been, but he didn't live his life overly distressed or driven by what those were. So enormous respect, and I think that that helped set me on the path that I've been on for the last 20, 25 years in terms of and giving back and being engaged in terms of social responsibility. So those three would be good examples.
Yeah, those are really nice ones, and they're kind of compounding, right? Mom, partner, and then the friends. It's pretty cool line up there, and I really appreciate that in every one of those you shared with us how it transformed or shows up in your life, whether it's directly the same or you morphed it into something that was more aligned with your value system. So that's important, because when we have a leader that we admire, they're humans. And as you mentioned with Prince Charles, right? Perfection isn't the thing. It's participation in this life.
Right.
So you find the people participating in a way, and you weave your own story. And then you're going to be potentially, whether you're at Prince status in our world or your mom, it doesn't really matter. People are going to then, by your definition of confidence and building trust and honesty, weave their own web. And I think that's really all we're here to do. Like at the end of that, that's it. Is if we can inspire and help other people align to their inner calling, it's pretty complete.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you should take a lot of credit. I kind of feel like that's one of your core purposes in life, whether it was foisted upon you or you just hungered for it.
Yeah.
You're in. I really like that phrase. I think you're inspiring people, not towards some specific goal, but inspiring people to find themselves and
Hmm.
connect in ways that allow them to lead more satisfying lives, to be better
Yeah.
leaders. That's obviously
Yeah.
one of your goals.
Yeah.
But somewhere in there, I think you're almost equally concerned with that that's a path to happiness.
Yes. Yeah. I do have a, thank you for acknowledging and seeing that, because I do have a fundamental core belief that a bunch of happy people is far better than some of the other things
Yeah.
around.
That's not terribly radical, but I like it.
It feels radical in today's time
That's
sometimes,
true.
for sure. Okay. So part of transparency is, you already touched on, is communication, which then leads to, you're honest. You find a way that to communicate that honesty in a way that hopefully ultimately builds trust, right? So that's the leadership journey in a nutshell. And so, how do you listen actively, and what does it mean to be clear in your communication to you?
Okay, listening. It's interesting that connecting those words actually is kind of essential, and by that I mean if you don't have some sort of almost tool in your kit for listening, almost everybody begins to listen poorly.
Mm-hmm.
They hear, and some again, all of a sudden they can't remember, and they can't remember what was said because they just heard. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't actually listen. For me, that tool or that device is I I love to say if I'm listening, I should be listening so that I can question.
Okay.
And consequently, I don't know where. I can't give credit to my mom or my dad, but I'd have to dig way back. I don't know where it was. Someone though convinced me long ago how to be a good dinner partner. And a good
Ooh.
dinner partner, the individual to your right or left, when they leave, they'll realize that they probably don't know you very well. That wasn't your intention, but the reason is that you were fascinated by them. And the
Yeah.
way they know you were fascinated by them is you kept asking questions. And if it's going to be engaging, the questions have to be good. And if the questions are good, then they have to be insightful. And if they're insightful, you have to listen. And the active listening part is you hear it and you're already, there's the action part. You're trying to figure out where that's going to go. Why is that important? Where was the incentive in their life for that? And if you've got that going on in your head, that truly, it should sound almost like active listening. Because gee, the other one said, you sit there and yeah, I listened, but without some kind of device, that doesn't take it anywhere. And kind of
Yeah.
when they're done, then you share, well, that reminds me of when I did this, right?
Sure.
That's hearing them.
Yes.
But active listening that leads to some kind of connection is that searching when they hear the thing. Well, why? You're asking why, and then translate that into the why directed to the individual. And sure enough, you're asking them why in a funny way. That's another way of saying I care. And if you're saying I care to the individual,
Mm-hmm.
most people really like having someone care.
Yes.
Why they did what they did, why they are where they are. I'm important. I matter to you at this moment, if not in the
Mhm.
grander scheme of things.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm a nut on it.
I love that you learned that in the context of a dinner party, because a lot of us would go to a dinner party, and I'm going to say I'm guilty of this. I would just find my best friend and talk to them. I'm an introvert by nature, so it creates a little anxiety for me. I can do it. I have done it. I will do it. But that put a different lens on it for me to just drop into curiosity with another human being in that environment, which I wouldn't have thought of necessarily as a place I would choose that. So thank you for that tip. That's really
It's
good.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. So what are your thoughts on the consequences of one's action taking place? And the context of that is around this act of communication. As you and I are engaging and you're asking better questions because you're present in the listening. Do you find that there's how do I say this? A consequence that comes out of that in any way that's impactful for you or for the other person potentially, or an example of such a time?
It's interesting. Certainly, I mean, I like the concept that in some of your writing, you make people think about consequences, and
Mm-hmm.
consequences. I think for me, consequences are really making you understand that there are choices,
Mm-hmm.
and consequences demand reflection. Um, and those two things I think are related. If it's always about choices and it's always reflecting, one of the important things is to keep the balance right. You can't
Mm-hmm.
be someone who overthinks and can't take action because they're all caught up in thinking of the consequences. At the same time, two things come out of it. Number one, I'm a huge believer that there should be a part of every day that you set aside for reflecting. Now, I say that my reflecting always starts with thank you.
Yeah.
So I tend to try to find a church somewhere. If not, then a quiet park, New York City, you can pull it off. You can pull it off in most places and
Yeah.
take a couple of minutes and start with thank you. But then the other is a little bit about consequences and reflecting on them. I think it was Confucius who said, when anger rises, think of the consequences. And all he
Mm.
was doing was connecting the fact that considering the consequences allows you to create priorities,
Mm-hmm.
to weigh things, right? Because consequences tells you what's important and not so important. It's a funny way of getting into
Yeah.
an evaluation set. That if you aren't thinking consequences, you could be easily misled into thinking that the importance is preset, and importance really could almost better be if everything is thought about in terms of consequences. You very quickly get, gee,
Mm-hmm.
this one doesn't much matter.
Yeah.
I can look at the decision tree, and the range between decision 1 and 5 is not very great. And even decision number 1, no one really much cares about. Why am I spending that much time on this one? You only get there. It could have been imposed. This is important. Someone told you that I need this by this time.
Mm-hmm.
But consequences gets to the heart of why does it matter and how
Yeah.
much does it matter, right?
Yeah.
And that's a thought process we often don't give enough time to.
No, for sure. And I think like if we talk corporations and all of that capitalism stuff, so many times the organization will have a learning event and it could go as planned, better than planned, or far worse than planned, anywhere in there.
Yeah.
And so often they'll have the idea of lessons learned. I'm sure you've been in many of those swap rooms and debriefings, but they don't take the time to reflect on if they could take the time on the front side to do
Mm.
this projection reflection of cost or impact consequences, that they would mitigate so much of the aftermath that they would possibly have deemed undesirable.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
because we don't, it's not in our bailiwick of muscles, it feels like we missed the opportunity. So
Yeah.
thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
what, I'm going to sneak in a little, it's probably not useful to much of anyone other than maybe someone who lives in New York, but I love, I think if you have a few favorite places
Uh
that
huh.
you can go and reflect, there's some value in that because you create kind of you can create a womb, a warm place that you feel safe in. And for me, it's the Louise Nevelson Chapel over at St. Peter's Church. Now, it happens to be, fairly close by, but, it's simply a place that I can go and I'm at peace with the fact that I am there to say thanks and to reflect. And you can find lots of other places, but sometimes there's an adjustment period. So there's an efficacy to a certain degree if you have a favorite place. And you see it in literature where there'll be a place by a pond, by a tree. That's my place. And, it's maybe kind of a worthy thing for someone who hears that to say, you know what? I'm not sure I've really worked to create my place. And I think I'll do that because that will help me make sure that I carve out that sort of time.
Yeah, I love that idea because when we have ritual in our life, right? This is a ritual of sorts.
Yeah, yes,
then we can create, and you can be in any country now, right? And you've been to this sacred place so many times, you know what it feels energetically to be there, and you could be halfway across the world and call that feeling in, right?
Yeah.
And handle it there, bringing that safety with you energetically, and not so much as in a physical place, but the physical place is the grounding event for that ability to take it with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I love that. Okay. So one of the last things on this topic that I get a lot of inquiry around is around the labeling that we do for ourselves and each other. And whether or not we find it helpful or not, we're going to put that on a shelf for a minute.
Okay.
But I don't want to make labeling good or bad because we're human beings and we have to sort hundreds of details coming at us thousands of times a day. So we're constantly sorting data. I want to do this. I don't want to do that. That person's for me. That person's not for me, whatever the thing. Right. And it becomes a labeling system just out of a processing of our computer brain. And one of the things that young and emerging leaders will ask me is, I get labeled as, young women do this very frequently. I get labeled as brass or aggressive. And my counterpart, usually male, has some of those same behaviors. And they have a different experience as a result of those behaviors sometimes. And so how can I be transparently me when I feel passionate, aggressive about a topic, and I get put over here in this label box, and then a counterpart can do it, and they get put over here in this preferred label box? Have you experienced that in your leadership, or maybe more importantly, when you've led others and you've seen something like that happen, how they've handled that for themselves?
Boy, you've bundled a lot in there.
I did. So just pick any part you want.
Any part I want. Well, I like a lot, and you've said it a little differently than I've sometimes articulated it, but labeling is natural. It can be harmful. It can be helpful. I like your, the brain, you called it the brain computer, it is trend recognition and extrapolation, which allows us to get more often than not, if you're intelligent and you observed well, that allows you to get to a conclusion a little faster, right? But it comes with, sand traps, because it doesn't work for everyone and in every situation. That doesn't mean it isn't useful, right?
Right.
So, I think there has to be a little respect for it. I've got to admit, when you can, try to create environments that are label free. So, I love it. When I went to the PMD program at Harvard, they intentionally wanted everyone, they encouraged jeans and polo-like shirts. They didn't want coats, jackets. They didn't want ties. And at first, didn't know what that was all about. But that was all about, let's not make it easy to see who's wealthy and who's not wealthy.
Yeah.
And designer clothes and all the rest. Get it just until you that might come up later, but after you've begun to figure out who someone really is versus the
Yeah.
label, and it's implicit, it's going to take place. If you see it, you're going to put two and two together. So push that off and think about that. If as a leader, you're trying to set up a conference or a meeting, think about how you do your icebreaker that stays away from things that might easily label you. Some of the things we think of in terms of introductions actually make the mistake of from the very beginning, allow people in effect to brag. Now you've had each individual kind of thrown out the label they'd like to be called. So there's ways to, once you understand that, make it an implicit part of how you organize. I loved when Sebastian and Annika, when they went to school in England, I liked schools that had uniforms.
Yes.
Right. They're just much more difficult for that labeling to take place. Now, that's a little sub thought. The other sub thought is, one of the things I appreciate most was, as I've done global traveling, it very much takes you out of your comfort zone, and it gives you an opportunity to redefine yourself. But also for someone, like me, who cares about language and how I express myself. When I went to Brazil, it was hugely important that I basically couldn't communicate very well, couldn't express myself very well. And in a sense, makes you kind of start all over, and makes you be inferior and looked down on. And it's really good for that to happen. And Brazil was probably double for me important, because huge generalization. I'm sure maybe you'll get a note from someone in the podcast. I don't think that's true, but the Brazilians generally, certainly there's a generation that doesn't respect and like particularly Americans, versus if they had their choice, they would rather their daughter marry a wonderful Frenchman, right, than a darn capitalist American. And, I was invited to families where, again, my association with the young girl in question, I was single when I moved to Brazil, was, oh my God, I hope they don't marry him. That's really good to experience. I'm not saying it's good, that prejudice in our own country, but when you otherwise wouldn't be exposed to being seen that way, and that's a label, it's really healthy. It makes you appreciate. Be careful how you label others, because you got to feel the pain yourself sometimes to understand that. And then you know where not to go, how to be more respectful, how to hold things in check until you get to know the individual better. So that would be the other thing for me. And I guess broadly, when I hear that and we'll do two things. I'll do the me, and I'll do the thinking of the third person. And I flip it. The easier one is, as soon as you start to have empathy and care about people, and you're an active listener, then, and you are, quote unquote, a leader, whether designated or not, when you're in a room and you see someone labeling, your job as a leader, even again, if not designated, that people are going to see you as a leader. If what you do is you see your responsibility, is to call it out. Oof, that wasn't fair. Melissa basically, said that, and then when Dan said it, you applauded him. Call it out, and people are, I think, ready for that. Oh my gosh, I guess I did. So it's easy when you see it, your responsibility as a leader, designated or not, call it out. On yourself, on myself, I guess, the key is, you and I have talked today a couple of times, and I talk about the importance of reflection. I think it's important to, if it's not who I think I am and I'm called it, it is to sit there and say, why? something about my behavior triggered that.
Mm-hmm.
So just make sure you give it credence. You don't reject it because it was negative, and you don't reject it because it doesn't fit your own self-image. But once you think that through, then be ready to say, all right, I'm good with that. Right.
Yeah.
Because that is who I am. So I don't like being called competitive, and
Ah.
lots of people call me competitive. So guess what? I understand that I don't like it because I think I myself think being competitive, I think I kind of don't want to. And yet I understand being what manifests itself is,
Mhm.
wanting to improve, wanting to do well. I don't think I'm obsessed about it. And maybe that's why I recoil with the label.
Yeah.
But at the same time, now and then you'll sit there and go, okay, maybe I'm being too competitive. And so make some adjustments. It shouldn't dictate your life, but reflect on why. And if you don't like the answer, then modify your behavior. And
Yeah.
if you're okay with that behavior, then get okay with the label.
Yeah. To all of that.
I don't know. Okay.
Because I'm literally going through, I'm thinking to my, as you were doing that, I'm like, oh, here's what I don't like to be called. He doesn't like to be called competitive. I don't like to be called assertive because of whatever. But I am. I mean, I have an opinion. I do my research, so I have opinions, and it doesn't make me right or wrong. It just means I have a voice. And it's very interesting I think that the key there, Truett, is the humility, whether you're looking within or without, right? Be kind to yourself, right? Because sometimes if you've done that work, right, if you really pause to look at yourself for a minute, there's probably more often than not, it's about the person giving you the label. It's their projection to you rather than so much about you. But you only can know that if you pause, right, in the moment and go,
Reflect.
well, am I being competitive right now? Or is that them feeling like they're going to lose the game? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Which one is it of those things?
Right.
So that was brilliant. Thank you. That was really good wrap up. And so transparency is one of those journeys that I think you just, for me, and I'd be curious as we're ending this part of the conversation, for me, the more confident I am in who I am, right? There's two things. One, the more confident I am in who I am, the more flexible I am in who I am, the more willing I am to challenge my own belief system and amend it or my behaviors.
Yeah.
And I'm also, when I've done that work, able to stand in the light. And that can be scary at times because who knows what could happen? Someone could
Yeah.
shoot.
Right.
I don't know, right? But I'm willing and able to stand inside and be really powerful, not aggressive, not forceful, but stand there and hold my line. And that comes through that one activity of humility and reflection.
Love it.
So,
Love it.
yeah.
Well, I would say in closing, thank you, but not just for the 30 minutes. I think that what you're doing in your writing, what you're doing in your coaching, I admire you for your heart and the way you're doing this fundamentally for others. And I love that generosity in you. So thank you for your time.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's been hard for me to receive such accolades and praise. So I'm letting that in and
But
I'm
you
getting
will.
warm
Yeah.
and uncomfortable.
And thank you.
So, and thank you. And thank you. Okay.
Okay.
So we'll connect
We'll look
next time
forward
when
to,
I
I'll
chat.
look
We'll
forward to
connect.
another one. All
Thank
righty.
you.
Take care. Bye bye.